Royal Guard notices an old homeless man in the cold. What he does next will warm your heart. What you're about to listen will leave you speechless. A Royal Guard's unexpected act of kindness changed everything in ways no one could have imagined. Don't forget to like, share, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The bitter winter wind howled through the streets of London, whipping around the corners of Buckingham Palace with an almost angry intensity. Tourist crowds huddled together, their excited chatter and camera clicks filling the air as they gathered to watch the famous Royal Guards in their crisp red uniforms and towering bearskin hats. These guards were known worldwide for their legendary discipline, standing perfectly still, faces expressionless, never breaking character no matter what happened around them. But on this freezing December morning, something was different, something that would change everything. Just a few feet away from one of the guards, an elderly man sat huddled against the palace gates, his thin, tattered coat offering little protection against the brutal cold. His weathered hands trembled as he pulled a threadbare blanket tighter around his shoulders. Tourists walked past him, as if he were invisible, some even stepping over his outstretched legs to get a better photo of the guard. So cold, so cold. The old man's whispered words formed small clouds in the freezing air. His voice was barely audible over the excited chatter of the crowd, but somehow it seemed to echo in the space between him and the motionless guard standing nearby. A group of teenage boys approached, laughing among themselves. One of them pulled out some coins and tossed them at the old man's feet, making a game of it. "Hey, old-timer," they called out mockingly. "Dance for us, and maybe we'll give you more." Their laughter cut through the air like shards of ice. The Royal Guard remained perfectly still, as he had been trained to do, but something flickered in his eyes, something that shouldn't have been there. Was it recognition? Pain? Anger? Whatever it was, it disappeared as quickly as it had come, his face returning to its practiced mask of neutrality. The old man's shoulders shook. Though whether from cold or silent tears, it was impossible to tell. He reached down slowly, painfully, trying to gather the scattered coins with trembling fingers. Each movement seemed to cost him tremendous effort, his joints stiff from the cold and age. A young mother hurried past with her small daughter, who pointed at the old man and asked, "Mommy, why is that man sitting there? Isn't he cold?" The mother pulled her daughter closer, quickening their pace. "Don't look, sweetie. Just keep walking." The temperature continued to drop as dark clouds gathered overhead, threatening snow. The old man's breathing became more labored, each exhale creating a larger cloud of vapor in the frigid air. His eyes began to lose focus, his head drooping forward slightly. The Royal Guard's fingers twitched ever so slightly at his side, a microscopic movement that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't watching incredibly closely. But it happened. And for these guards, trained to maintain absolute stillness, even that tiny movement was unprecedented. The old man's hand suddenly went to his chest, his face contorting in pain. His breathing became even more ragged, more desperate. A few tourists glanced his way, concern briefly crossing their faces before they turned back to their photos and selfies. The guard's jaw clenched, another barely perceptible movement. His eyes, trained forward as always, seemed to be fighting against themselves, struggling not to look at the suffering man just feet away from him. Years of training warred against something else, something deeper, more human. The old man's eyes rolled back slightly, his body starting to sway. His hand clutched more desperately at his chest as his breathing became shallow and quick. Time seemed to slow down as he began to pitch forward. And then, it happened. The guard's head turned, just slightly, just enough to look directly at the old man. In that moment, something passed across his face, something that made several tourists gasp and grab for their phones. Because Royal Guards never move, they never break character, they never show emotion. But this guard's face showed something that would change everything: recognition. The old man's eyes met the guard's for just a moment, and in that brief second, the air seemed to crackle with unspoken meaning. A tourist raised her phone, capturing the impossible moment when a Royal Guard broke his stance. But what happened next would leave everyone stunned. The old man's trembling hand reached out, almost unconsciously toward the guard. His cracked lips moved, forming words too quiet for anyone to hear. But the guard's face changed. It was subtle, the slightest widening of the eyes, a barely noticeable tightening of the jaw. But to those watching closely, it was as if an earthquake had struck the usually stone-faced soldier. "Please!" The old man's voice came out as a whisper, carrying on the wind. "I never thought—" His words trailed off as another wave of pain crossed his face. He clutched his chest again, his breathing becoming more labored with each passing second. The crowd had grown larger now, phones recording what they thought would be just another viral video of someone trying to make a royal guard move. But they had no idea what was really unfolding before their eyes. They couldn't see the battle raging behind the guard's disciplined exterior, couldn't understand the weight of the choice hanging in the frozen air between him and the suffering man. A young boy in the crowd tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, the guard looks scared. Why does he look scared?" The father shushed his son, but the boy's innocent observation hit upon a truth that the adults were too busy filming to notice. There was fear in the guard's eyes, not fear of breaking protocol, but fear of something much deeper, much more personal. The old man's hand dropped to his side as his strength failed him. His eyes began to close, but before they did, he spoke again, his words slightly louder this time. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I failed you." The words seemed to strike the guard like physical blows, each one making his rigid posture waver just slightly. Snow began to fall, soft flakes landing on the old man's gray hair and tattered coat. The guard's gloved hands clenched into fists at his sides. Another break in protocol, another sign that something unprecedented was happening. A few people in the crowd noticed and nudged each other, pointing and whispering. "I knew him once." The old man continued, his voice growing fainter. "The guard, not this one, but—" His words dissolved into a fit of coughing that shook his entire frame. When he caught his breath again, tears were freezing on his cheeks. "I stood where he stands, years ago, before I lost everything." The guard's breathing had become visible now, forming rapid clouds in the cold air. His eyes darted to the side, checking for his commanding officer, then back to the old man. The crowd held their breath, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that went far beyond their expectations of a simple guard-breaking video. "Sir?" A woman in the crowd stepped forward, her phone lowered, concern finally overtaking curiosity. "Sir, do you need help? Should someone call an ambulance?" But the old man didn't seem to hear her. His eyes were fixed on the guard, seeing something that no one else could see. "You look just like him," he mumbled, his words becoming less coherent. "Just like my boy. My beautiful boy. I lost him too. Lost everything." The guard's face had gone pale beneath his stoic expression. His chest rose and fell with quick, sharp breaths. The snow was falling harder now, creating a curtain of white between him and the crowd, but nothing could hide the emotion fighting its way across his features. The old man slumped forward suddenly, his body giving in to the cold and exhaustion. And in that moment, something incredible happened. Something that would soon be shared millions of times. Something that would touch hearts around the world. The royal guard moved. It wasn't a small movement, not a twitch or a slight turn of the head. The guard stepped forward, breaking formation entirely, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The crowd gasped collectively, hundreds of phones raised to capture what happened next. In 3 quick strides, he reached the old man's side, catching him before he could fall face first onto the frozen ground. The guard's white gloves contrasted sharply against the old man's tattered coat as he gently supported him, lowering him back to sit against the palace gates. "Someone call an ambulance?" The guard's voice, unused to speaking while on duty, came out rough and urgent. A few people in the crowd jumped at the sound. Royal guards never spoke, never moved, never broke character. But this one had just done all 3. The old man's eyes fluttered open at the sound of the voice. He looked up at the guard's face, now close to his own, and something sparked in his tired eyes. "That voice," he whispered, his words barely audible over the excited murmur of the crowd. "I know that voice." The guard's hands trembled slightly as he removed his thick gloves, placing them carefully over the old man's frozen fingers. Without the gloves, his own hands were young and strong, marked with a small scar across the right knuckles. The old man's eyes fixed on that scar, and his breath caught in his throat. "The climbing accident," the old man murmured, his voice stronger now, despite his weakness. "The boy who fell 15 years ago." His eyes searched the guard's face with desperate intensity. "It can't be!" The guard's professional mask cracked further, emotion flooding his features. His hand went to his pocket, pulling out something that made the old man's eyes widen. A worn, creased photograph. The guard's fingers shook as he unfolded it, holding it where they both could see. In the photo, a younger version of the old man stood proud in a Royal Guard's uniform, his arm around a small boy with a bandaged hand. They were both smiling, standing in front of these very same palace gates. The timestamp in the corner read 2009. "You saved my life that day," the guard said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I was just a stupid kid, trying to climb the gates on a dare. When I fell, you caught me. You got me help. You visited me in the hospital." His words came faster now, years of memories spilling out. "You told me stories about being a guard, about honor and duty and protecting people. You're the reason I became a guard myself." The crowd had fallen silent, phones still recording, but forgotten in hands that hung limply at their sides. Snow continued to fall around the guard and the old man, creating a peaceful curtain that seemed to separate them from the rest of the world. "James!" the old man whispered, reaching up with a trembling hand to touch the guard's face. "Little James Mitchell?" Tears began to roll down his weathered cheeks. I never dreamed I'd see you again. Not after you disappeared," James finished, his own eyes glistening. "I looked for you. For years I looked. What happened? You were a guard one day, then gone the next. No one would tell me anything." The old man's face crumpled with shame and old pain. "My wife, my Sarah, she got sick, so sick. The treatments took everything we had, then more. I sold everything, borrowed more. When she died," his voice broke. "I couldn't face anyone, couldn't bear to stand proud in this uniform anymore. I just walked away. Been walking ever since." A senior guard had appeared at the edge of the scene, his face thunderous at this unprecedented breach of protocol. But as he opened his mouth to bark an order, something extraordinary happened. The old man reached up with shaking fingers and touched the collar of James's uniform, finding something there that made him gasp. A small silver pin, tarnished with age, that hadn't been visible before. "You kept it?" the old man breathed. "After all these years?" James's hand went to the pin, the same pin that was visible on the old man's uniform in the photograph. "Of course I kept it. You told me it would remind me of what really matters, that sometimes the greatest honor comes not from following rules, but from following your heart," the old man finished, his voice barely a whisper. The senior guard stopped in his tracks, his own eyes going to the pin. His face changed as recognition dawned, and what he did next would leave the watching crowd in tears. Instead of shouting orders or demanding James return to his post, the senior guard removed his own tall bearskin hat and held it against his chest. His face, usually stern and commanding, softened with an emotion that no one expected to see. "Captain Thomas Wilson," he said softly, his voice carrying in the hushed silence that had fallen over the crowd. "I served under you for 3 years, sir. Best commander I ever had." He stepped forward and saluted the old man, snow falling gently on his exposed head. The old man, Captain Wilson, stared up at him in disbelief. "Roberts," he whispered. "Young Peter Roberts?" His hands trembled as he tried to return the salute, but his weakness made the gesture shaky and uncertain. "Don't try to move, sir," Roberts said, kneeling down beside James in the snow. He turned to the crowd, his voice taking on an authority that made several people straighten their backs instinctively. "Did someone call that ambulance?" "It's on its way," a woman called from the crowd, her phone still in her hand. 3 minutes out." Roberts nodded, then did something else unexpected. He removed his own thick winter coat, not the ceremonial uniform, but the heavy coat guards wore for warmth, and draped it over Captain Wilson's shoulders. "You always taught us," he said quietly, "that true strength isn't in standing still, but in knowing when to move." The old man's eyes filled with tears again. "I failed," he whispered, "failed my duty, my post, failed everything I taught you all." "No, sir," James said firmly, still holding on to his former savior's hand. "You taught us that duty isn't just about following orders. It's about protecting people, helping them. That's exactly what you did. You gave up everything to try to save your wife." A siren wailed in the distance, growing closer. The crowd had grown even larger, but instead of the usual tourist excitement, there was a respectful silence. Many were wiping tears from their eyes as they watched the scene unfold. "The pin," Roberts said suddenly, looking more closely at the silver emblem on James's collar. "That's your Medal of Distinguished Service, isn't it, sir? The one you received for saving those children from the fire in '05? Captain Wilson's hand went to the pin on James's uniform. "I gave it to him," he said softly, "that day at the hospital. Told him to keep it, to remember. To remember that courage comes in many forms," James finished, "that sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing tall, but kneeling down to help someone who's fallen." The ambulance's siren grew louder, and red lights began to flash against the falling snow. But before the paramedics could arrive, something remarkable happened. One by one, other Royal Guards, who had been watching from their posts, began to move. They stepped away from their stations, forming a line, creating an honor guard leading to the ambulance. "What are you doing?" Captain Wilson asked, his voice weak but filled with wonder. "Showing you that your lessons weren't forgotten, sir," Roberts replied. He looked at the other guards who stood at perfect attention, creating a path through the crowd. "Every one of these guards has heard the stories about you, about the commander who taught us that humanity should never be sacrificed for protocol." The ambulance pulled up, and the paramedics jumped out, rushing toward them with their equipment. But they slowed when they saw the line of Royal Guards, the reverence in the air. "I don't deserve this," Captain Wilson whispered, trying to shrink into himself. "I'm nothing now. Nobody." "You're wrong," James said firmly, squeezing the old man's hand. "You're the man who saved my life twice. Once when you caught me falling, and once when you taught me what real honor means. And now—" He looked up at Roberts, a silent question in his eyes. Roberts nodded, understanding passing between them. "And now," he said, "it's our turn to catch you, sir." The paramedics reached them, but what happened next would prove that this story was far from over. Because just as they began to help Captain Wilson onto the stretcher, a royal aide came running through the snow, clutching a message that would change everything. The aide, red-faced from running, pushed through the crowd and whispered something urgently in Robert's ear. The senior guard's eyes widened, and for the first time since he'd recognized Captain Wilson, he looked truly shocked. "Wait," Roberts called to the paramedics, holding up his hand. He turned to Captain Wilson, who was now propped up on the stretcher, wrapped in the guards' warm coats. "Sir, I don't quite know how to say this." The crowd leaned forward unconsciously, phones still recording, everyone sensing that another extraordinary moment was about to unfold. The snow continued to fall softly around them, creating an almost magical atmosphere. "The Queen," Roberts paused, collecting himself. "Her Majesty remembers you, sir. She was watching the live feed from the security cameras and recognized you immediately. He glanced at the aide, who nodded encouragingly. "She's asking that you be taken to the palace medical wing instead of the hospital." Captain Wilson's face went pale. "No," he whispered, trying to sit up. "No, I can't. Not like this. Not in these clothes, in this state." James gripped his hand tighter. "Sir, do you remember what you told me in the hospital? About how it's not our uniforms that make us worthy, but our hearts?" The old man's eyes filled with tears again. "But the Queen, after how I left—" The royal aide stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Her Majesty specifically mentioned the fire of 2005, sir. She never forgot how you ran into that burning nursery without a second thought. The aide's voice caught slightly. "She's been worried about you since you disappeared. There were searches, but no one could find you." The paramedics looked uncertain, glancing between the stretcher and the palace gates. Roberts took charge, his military training kicking in. "James, you and Phillips go with the captain. The rest of you back to your posts, but stand proud. Today you've witnessed what real service looks like." As the guards began to move, something caught Captain Wilson's eye. He reached out a trembling hand toward James's uniform pocket, where the old photograph was still visible. "May I?" he asked softly. James carefully took out the photo and placed it in the old man's hands. Captain Wilson stared at it for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edges of the image. "I had another copy of this," he said, his voice distant with memory. "Kept it with me even after everything fell apart. Lost it somewhere on the streets a few years ago. broke my heart all over again. I know, James said quietly. I found it. The old man's head snapped up, his eyes wide. What? James swallowed hard, emotion making his voice rough. 3 years ago, I was walking my beat in Trafalgar Square, found a wet, crumpled photo under a bench, almost threw it away, but something made me look at it first. When I recognized you, he had to stop, compose himself. I searched that area every day for months, sir, asked everyone, but you were already gone. You looked for me? Captain Wilson's voice was barely a whisper. We all did, Roberts added, gesturing to the other guards. When James showed us the photo, told us you might be homeless, we all kept our eyes open. Some of us volunteered at shelters, hoping. The aide cleared her throat gently. Sir, Her Majesty is waiting. Captain Wilson looked around at the guards standing at attention, at the crowd still filming with tears in their eyes, at the palace rising majestically behind them. I never thought, he started, then stopped, overwhelmed. Sometimes the path back home is longer than we expect, James said softly, but that doesn't mean we're not meant to find it. As they began to move the stretcher toward the palace gates, someone in the crowd started clapping. The applause spread quickly, growing into a thunderous celebration that echoed off the palace walls. But what awaited Captain Wilson inside those walls would prove to be the most extraordinary part of this story yet. Because sometimes, when we think we've lost everything, life has a way of showing us that nothing is ever truly lost. It's just waiting to be found again. And as the palace gates opened to welcome home a forgotten hero, no one could have predicted the amazing twist that was about to unfold. The warmth of the palace hit them like a wave as they entered through the grand doors. Captain Wilson's eyes darted around, taking in the familiar surroundings he thought he'd never see again. The marble floors, the rich carpets, the paintings on the walls, everything exactly as he remembered, yet somehow different through the eyes of a man who had spent years sleeping on cold streets. The medical wing has been prepared, the aide said softly, leading them down a corridor. Staff members stopped and stared as they passed, whispers following in their wake. The sight was certainly unusual. A stretcher carrying a homeless man, accompanied by 2 royal guards in full uniform, moving through the palace's elegant halls. James walked beside the stretcher, still holding the captain's hand, while Phillips walked ahead, clearing their path. The paramedics had been professionally discreet, but their eyes kept widening at each new grand room they passed through. Suddenly, Captain Wilson's grip on James's hand tightened. "Wait," he said, his voice urgent. They were passing a large portrait on the wall, and his eyes were fixed on it with an intensity that made everyone stop. The painting showed a group of royal guards from years ago, standing proud in their uniforms. In the center stood a younger Captain Wilson, his chest decorated with medals, including the one that now rested on James's collar. "I remember that day," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The Queen had just presented me with the Distinguished Service Medal. She said," his voice caught, "she said she'd never seen such bravery, running into that nursery fire without a thought for my own safety." James stared at the portrait, at the proud, strong man his mentor had once been. "What made you do it, sir?" "Run into the fire?" The old man's eyes grew distant. "I heard a child crying. Didn't even think about it, really. Some things," he glanced at James, "some things are more important than protocol, more important than safety, more important than anything." "Like trying to save your wife," James said softly. Captain Wilson's eyes filled with tears again. "Sarah loved this place, used to come watch me on parade every Sunday. Even after she got sick, she'd sit in her wheelchair, smiling up at me." His voice broke. "The treatments were so expensive. When they told us there was an experimental procedure that might save her, I sold everything. My medals, our house, borrowed money I knew I could never repay." "Sir," the aide interrupted gently, "Her Majesty is waiting in the medical wing." But before they could move, another voice spoke from behind them, a voice that made everyone freeze. Tom Wilson?" Captain Wilson's face went white. Standing at the end of the corridor was an elderly man in a crisp uniform adorned with medals, General Michael Harrison, commander of the Royal Guard, but he wasn't wearing his usual stern expression. Instead, his face showed pure shock and something else. Guilt. "Michael," Captain Wilson whispered. The general walked forward slowly, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. "All these years," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "All these years, I've been trying to find you, to tell you." He stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "Tell me what?" Captain Wilson asked. "About the fund," the general said. "The one we created after you disappeared. When we learned why you'd left, what had happened with Sarah." He took a deep breath. "Every guard, every officer, we all contributed. We wanted to help, to pay for her treatment. But by the time we had enough, you were gone." Captain Wilson's hand trembled in James's grip. "A fund?" "Yes." The general's voice was heavy with regret. "And after we couldn't find you, we turned it into something permanent. The Wilson Foundation. It helps guards and their families who face medical crises. We've helped dozens of families over the years, all because of you." The old man on the stretcher started to shake, overwhelmed by this revelation. But what the general said next would shake him even more deeply. "And Tom," the general stepped closer, reaching into his uniform pocket, "there's something else you need to know. Something about Sarah's last days that I've been keeping safe for you all these years." The general pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. Captain Wilson stared at it, his face a mixture of hope and fear. The envelope was addressed to him in handwriting he clearly recognized, Sarah's delicate script. "She gave this to me the day before." The general's voice caught. "She knew you were selling everything, working yourself to exhaustion trying to save her. She made me promise not to give it to you until after. But then, you disappeared." With trembling hands, Captain Wilson took the envelope. The paramedics and the aide exchanged glances, silently agreeing to give him a moment. James started to step back too, but the old man's grip on his hand tightened, keeping him close. "Read it for me, son," Captain Wilson whispered, his eyes too filled with tears to see clearly. "Please." James carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was thin, the blue ink slightly faded, but the words were still clear. He began to read. "My dearest Tom, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Don't be angry with Michael for keeping this from you. I made him promise. I couldn't bear to see you destroy yourself trying to save me. You've always been my guardian angel, my protector, my royal guard. But sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting. It's knowing when to let go. You taught me that, remember? The day you saved those children from the fire, you told me that true courage isn't about standing still, but about moving when it matters most. I've seen you selling your medals, working extra shifts, borrowing money you'll never be able to repay. My darling, please stop. No amount of time would be enough with you, but I don't want my last gift to be a burden of debt and despair that crushes your beautiful spirit. Remember how we used to watch the changing of the guard together? How proud I was to see you standing there, tall and strong. That's how I want you to live, my love. Standing tall, helping others, being the wonderful man I fell in love with. I'm not afraid, Tom. How could I be, when you've shown me what real courage looks like? But I am afraid for you. Promise me you won't let grief destroy you. Promise me you'll keep standing guard, if not at the palace, then in life itself. There are always people who need protection, who need help, who need someone to show them what strength and dignity look like. You are so much more than your uniform, my darling. You are the man who runs into fires to save children, the man who caught a falling boy and changed his life, the man who taught young guards that honor isn't about standing still, but about having a heart that knows when to move. I love you, Tom Wilson. I've loved you since the day I first saw you in your uniform, and I'll love you long after I'm gone. But please, my darling, don't let my passing be the end of your story. Let it be a turning point, a moment when you chose to keep standing tall, keep helping others, keep being the hero I know you are. All my love, forever and always, Sarah. James's voice cracked as he finished reading. The corridor was completely silent except for the sound of quiet weeping, not just from Captain Wilson, but from everyone present. Even the general was wiping his eyes. She knew, Captain Wilson whispered. She knew what I would do, how I would fall apart. She tried to save me one last time. She did save you, the general said softly. Because you're here now. You're standing tall again. Or you will be, once we get you proper care. Captain Wilson looked down at his tattered clothes, then up at the Grand Palace corridor. How can I ever... But before he could finish his question, a palace attendant came hurrying down the corridor, his face flushed with excitement. Her Majesty, he announced breathlessly. Requests Captain Wilson's presence as soon as he's been seen by the doctors. And she asks that young guard Mitchell accompany him. James's eyes widened in surprise. Me? But... The attendant wasn't finished. Her Majesty also said... He paused, double-checking his message. She said to tell Captain Wilson that Sarah was right. It's time for him to stand tall again. She has a position in mind that would honor both his past service and his humanity. Captain Wilson's grip on James's hand tightened again as tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. Because in that moment, he realized that Sarah had been right about something else too. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter that would touch more lives than he could possibly imagine. The Palace Medical Wing was a stark contrast to the cold streets where Captain Wilson had spent so many years. Clean, warm, and filled with state-of-the-art equipment, it felt like another world entirely. The doctors moved quickly but gently, checking his vital signs, treating him for exposure to the cold, and addressing years of neglected health issues. James hadn't left his side, still in his full guard uniform, standing at parade rest near the bed. The general had gone to make arrangements, but not before placing Sarah's letter carefully on the bedside table, where Captain Wilson could see it. Your blood pressure is quite high, the doctor said, frowning at her instruments, and you're suffering from moderate hypothermia. We'll need to warm you up slowly. She turned to a nurse. Bring the warming blankets and let's start an IV for fluids and medication. As the medical team worked, a palace valet appeared with a garment bag. Her Majesty thought you might want this, sir, he said, carefully unzipping the bag to reveal a pristine Royal Guard dress uniform, complete with medals and insignia. Captain Wilson's eyes filled with tears again. My old uniform. How ... Not your old one, sir, the valet said softly. This is new, made to your measurements from the records. Her Majesty ordered it specially when she recognized you on the security feed. He paused, then added, She never had your name removed from the active duty roster, you know. All these years, you've technically still been a member of the Royal Guard. The doctor looked up from her work. He'll need at least an hour of treatment before he can even think about getting dressed. His body temperature needs to stabilize. James finally spoke up. Sir, may I make a suggestion? When Captain Wilson nodded, he continued. Let them take care of you properly. The Queen has waited all these years. She can wait another hour to see you at your best. A weak smile crossed the old man's face. You sound just like Sarah now. She always told me to take better care of myself. As the medical team continued their work, more visitors arrived. Guards who had heard the story came to pay their respects, each one saluting the man in the hospital bed as if he were still in his full uniform. Some brought small gifts, a book, a warm pair of socks, a cup of proper tea. But, most importantly, they brought stories. You trained my father, sir, one young guard said. He told me about how you taught him to help lost children find their parents, even though it meant breaking formation. I remember when you caught that pickpocket, another added. Instead of having him arrested, you got him a job in the palace kitchens. He's head chef now. Did you know that? Each story seemed to add color back to Captain Wilson's cheeks, strength back to his bearing. The doctors worked around the steady stream of visitors, checking his vital signs with increasing satisfaction. Then the palace attendant returned, looking slightly nervous. Her Majesty has been informed of the medical situation, he announced. She sends word that she will receive Captain Wilson and Guard Mitchell in the blue drawing room in 2 hours' time. He hesitated, then added, She said to tell you that Sarah would be proud of you, sir. Her Majesty used to talk with her quite often when she came to watch the changing of the guard. Captain Wilson's hand went to Sarah's letter on the bedside table. She never told me she spoke with the Queen, he whispered. Sarah knew how proud you were of serving, James said gently. Maybe she didn't want you to know she'd told the Queen about your struggles, about selling your medals to pay for her treatment. The doctor interrupted, checking the monitors again. Your temperature is returning to normal, sir. A bit more time with the warming blankets, then we can see about getting you ready for that uniform. As if on cue, 2 more valets appeared, carrying everything needed to help transform the man who had been sleeping rough just hours ago back into the proud captain he had once been. A barber followed them, his tools at the ready. Captain Wilson looked overwhelmed. I don't deserve all this, he protested weakly. Sarah's letter would disagree, James said firmly. And so would every guard who's ever served under you. So would those children you saved from the fire, and their children too." He paused, then added softly, "So would that little boy you caught when he was foolish enough to try climbing the palace gates." The old man's eyes met his, and something passed between them, understanding, gratitude, and a spark of the old strength returning. Because sometimes, James realized, the greatest act of courage isn't running into a fire or catching a falling child. Sometimes it's simply allowing yourself to be helped, to be lifted up, to be reminded of who you once were, and who you could be again. But even as the medical team and valets prepared Captain Wilson for his audience with the Queen, none of them could have predicted the extraordinary offer she was about to make. 2 hours later, Captain Wilson stood before a full-length mirror in the palace dressing room, barely recognizing himself. The valets and barber had worked miracles. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven, and his new uniform fit perfectly, medals gleaming on his chest. James stood beside him, both of them reflected in the mirror, the young guard and his mentor, united again after all these years. "Your pin, sir," James said softly, reaching up to remove the Distinguished Service Medal from his own collar. But Captain Wilson stopped him with a gentle hand. "Keep it, son," he said. "It found its way to exactly where it belongs." His voice was stronger now, some of his old authority returning with the uniform and the medical care. "Besides," he added with a small smile, "I seem to have quite a few medals here already." The walk to the blue drawing room felt both familiar and strange to Captain Wilson. His steps were steady now, though he still leaned slightly on James's arm. Guards they passed snapped to attention, saluting crisply. Palace staff smiled and bowed. It was as if the years on the streets had been just a long, dark dream. Outside the blue drawing room, they paused. The general was waiting for them, his face breaking into a warm smile at the sight of his old friend restored to his former dignity. "Tom," he said softly, "you look like yourself again?" "I feel like I'm in a dream," Captain Wilson admitted. "Afraid I might wake up back on those cold streets." "No more cold streets," the general said firmly. "Not ever again. And after you meet with Her Majesty." He trailed off, a twinkle in his eye suggesting he knew something they didn't. The doors opened, and they were announced. The blue drawing room was exactly as Captain Wilson remembered, elegant, bright, and somehow both grand and intimate at the same time. And there, sitting in her favorite chair by the window, was the Queen. She stood as they entered, and to everyone's surprise, walked forward to meet them, instead of waiting for them to approach her. Protocol dictated that they should bow, but before they could, she spoke. "Captain Wilson," she said warmly, "or perhaps I should say, my favorite guardian angel." Captain Wilson's eyes widened at the familiar phrase, the same words Sarah had used in her letter. The Queen smiled gently. "Yes, Sarah told me she called you that. She and I had many lovely conversations while she watched you on parade. Such a brave woman, your Sarah. She worried so about you, you know, about how hard you were working, how much you were sacrificing. Your Majesty, Captain Wilson's voice caught. "No, let me finish," the Queen said kindly. "Sarah made me promise something too, just as she did with General Harrison. She made me promise that if you ever found your way back to us, I would tell you about the children." "The children, ma'am?" Captain Wilson looked confused. "The ones you saved from the fire," the Queen explained. "They've grown up now, of course. One is a doctor at Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. Another teaches at a primary school in Manchester. The youngest," she smiled, "the baby you carried out last, she's training to be a firefighter. All of them asked about you over the years. All of them wanted to thank you." Tears rolled down Captain Wilson's cheeks, but he stood tall, years of training keeping him at attention despite his emotion. "And then there's this young man." The Queen turned her gaze to James. "The boy you caught when he fell, who grew up to wear the uniform you taught him to honor. Do you know what he's done, Captain?" "Ma'am?" "Every Sunday for the past 3 years, he's volunteered at homeless shelters, looking for you, yes, but also helping others who reminded him of you. He started a program, you see, helping homeless veterans find their way back to service. Not necessarily military service, but service to their communities." James blushed deeply as Captain Wilson turned to look at him in surprise. "And that," the Queen continued, "is precisely why I've asked you both here today, because I have a proposition for you." She paused, her eyes twinkling. How would you feel, Captain Wilson, about heading up a new royal initiative? One that combines the discipline and honor of the Royal Guard with the compassion and understanding you've always shown? The general stepped forward, producing a document. The Wilson Foundation is already established, he said. With Her Majesty's blessing, we'd like to expand it, not just helping guards and their families with medical needs, but reaching out to all veterans who've fallen on hard times. Who better to lead it than the man who inspired it? And who better to assist him, the Queen added, than the young guard who never stopped looking for his mentor? That is, if Guard Mitchell is willing to accept a promotion and a new posting, what happened next would become the stuff of palace legend, a story that would be told and retold for years to come. Because sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the dramatic rescues or the daring acts of bravery. Sometimes they're the quiet moments when everything comes full circle, when lost souls find their way home, and when love, in all its forms, proves stronger than any hardship. 1 year later, the palace grounds were filled with people gathering for a very special ceremony. The winter air was crisp but clear. No snow this time, just bright sunshine making the guards' uniforms gleam. But today, alongside the traditional royal guards, there stood a new contingent, men and women in specially designed uniforms that combine military precision with a subtle difference. A small angel wing pin on their collars, marking them as members of the Wilson Foundation's outreach team. Captain Wilson, no longer the broken man from the streets but now strong and dignified in his role as Foundation Director, stood at attention beside James, who had indeed accepted both the promotion and the new posting. Together, they had spent the past year building something extraordinary. The Wilson Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a medical fund for guards had become a lifeline for veterans across the country. They had teams working in every major city, searching for former service members who had fallen through the cracks, offering them not just help, but hope and purpose. "Look there," James whispered to Captain Wilson, nodding toward a group of people taking their seats in the front row. They were the children from the fire, now adults, come to witness this day. Behind them sat former homeless veterans, now cleaned up and proudly wearing foundation pins, the first graduates of their rehabilitation program. The palace chef, once a young pickpocket given a second chance, had prepared a feast for after the ceremony. The Royal Guard band was in position, ready to play. Even the teenage boys who had once mocked Captain Wilson on the street were there. They had sought him out to apologize and had become regular volunteers at the Foundation's youth outreach programs. As the Queen took her position for the ceremony, Captain Wilson felt something in his pocket, Sarah's letter, which he always carried with him now. Her words had proven prophetic. He was indeed still standing guard, not at a palace gate, but over the lives of those who needed protection and guidance most. The ceremony itself was moving but simple. The Queen officially dedicated the new Wilson Foundation headquarters, built on palace grounds, a place where veterans could come for help, where guards and their families could find support, and where the spirit of service that Captain Wilson had always embodied would live on. But it was what happened after the ceremony that truly captured the meaning of everything that had transpired that cold winter day a year ago. A young boy, about the same age James had been when Captain Wilson caught him falling from the gates, approached them shyly. He was wearing a miniature guard's uniform, and his mother, standing behind him, encouraged him forward. "Are you really him?" the boy asked Captain Wilson. "The guardian angel guard?" Captain Wilson knelt down to the boy's level, just as he had done with James all those years ago. "And who told you about that?" he asked gently. "Everyone," the boy exclaimed. "They tell us the story at school, about how you saved the children from the fire, and how you helped people even when you were having a hard time yourself, and how you teach guards to be kind even when they're being strong." Captain Wilson smiled, feeling James's supportive presence beside him. "Would you like to know a secret?" he asked the boy. When the child nodded eagerly, he continued, "The real angels are all around us. They're the people who help others when they're falling, the ones who notice when someone is cold or hungry or lost. The ones who remember that being strong doesn't mean you can't also be kind." The boy thought about this seriously, then asked, "Could I be one too? When I grow up?" "You don't have to wait until you grow up," James joined in, sharing a meaningful look with his mentor. "You can start right now, just by noticing when someone needs help, and being brave enough to do something about it." As they talked with the boy and his mother, more people gathered around, drawn by the warmth and authenticity of the moment. The queen, watching from nearby, smiled softly, remembering Sarah's words about her husband being a guardian angel. Looking around at all the lives that had been touched and changed, at the new generation being inspired to combine strength with compassion, at the way a single act of kindness had grown into something that would help thousands, Captain Wilson finally understood what Sarah had meant in her letter about letting his story continue. Because this wasn't just his story anymore, it was James's story, and the story of every person they would help. It was the story of every guard who would learn that true strength lies in knowing when to move, when to help, when to show compassion. It was the story of how one moment of human connection on a cold winter's day could spark a movement that would warm hearts for generations to come. And somewhere, Captain Wilson knew, Sarah was smiling. Because in the end, she had been right about everything. He was still standing tall, still helping others, still being the hero she had always known him to be. Not just a royal guard anymore, but something even more powerful. A guardian angel who had found his way back home, only to discover that his greatest purpose still lay ahead. And that, perhaps, was the most magnificent twist of all.